The scent of white lilies was thick enough to choke on. I stood near the tall, arched windows of the Phillips family estate, my fingers curled tightly around a cold, untouched glass of water. Outside, a gray afternoon drizzle tapped against the glass, blurring the manicured gardens into dark, weeping shapes. Inside, the parlor was filled with the quiet, expensive murmur of people in black silk and wool. They moved in slow, practiced patterns, offering their condolences for the passing of Spencer Phillips, my grandfather, the man who had spent 40 years building the Phillips Group into a $150 million real estate empire. To the public, he was a visionary. To the people in this room, he was a golden ticket. To me, he was the man who had signed my death warrant. In my first life, I had stood in this exact spot, weeping genuine tears of grief. I had been so proud when Philip Buchanan, our family's longtime lawyer, stepped up to the front of the room and announced that my grandfather had bypassed everyone else to name me, Isabella Phillips, as his sole successor. I had thought it was a reward for my dedication. I had thought he loved me the most. I didn't know the company was a hollowed-out shell. I didn't know about the secret offshore accounts, the massive illegal debts, and the syndicate that actually controlled our logistics chain. I had stepped onto the throne with a smile, only to be arrested by federal agents 6 months later. My family had vanished with the clean assets, leaving me to rot in a cold cell until my heart gave out from the stress. But the universe had given me a second chance. I woke up in my bed 2 weeks before grandfather's passing. My plan for this life was simple. I didn't want the empire. I didn't want the crown. I wanted to look so utterly unstable and incompetent that the board of directors would refuse to let me near the CEO chair. If I could force them to pass the title to my sister, Brooklyn, I could quietly drain the clean, uncompromised cash reserves I knew about and disappear before the federal hammer fell. I took a slow sip of water and looked down at my clothes. I had deliberately chosen a black dress that was 2 sizes too large. It hung loosely on my shoulders, making me look thin and exhausted. I hadn't made any makeup. My hair was tied back in a messy, hurried knot, with loose strands falling around my face. I wanted them to see a grieving, fragile girl who couldn't handle the pressure of a boardroom, let alone a multi-million-dollar company. "She looks completely lost," a quiet voice whispered a few feet away. I didn't turn my head, but I glanced through the reflection in the window. It was Andrew Norman, one of our largest shareholders, speaking to another board member. "Spencer was foolish to think she could run this place. Look at her. She's cracking under the grief. The market will eat her alive." A cold spark of satisfaction flared in my chest. Yes, write me off. Tell the lawyer I'm unfit. I let my shoulders slump even lower, staring blankly at the floor as if I were about to burst into tears. I just needed to maintain this act through the wake, and then tomorrow, during the reading of the will, I would officially decline the position due to my fragile mental state. "Isabella, darling." The voice was soft, sweet, and carried a warmth that made my hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned slowly. Brooklyn stood there, my sister. She looked absolutely flawless. Her dark hair was styled into a neat, elegant bun, without a single strand out of place. Her black designer dress fit her perfectly, modest, professional, and striking. She held a small lace handkerchief in one hand, her eyes slightly red, as if she had been crying, but her posture was straight and strong. She looked like a natural leader ready to carry the family through a tragedy. In my first life, Brooklyn had hugged me tightly when I was named CEO. She had whispered how proud she was of me, only to stand in the back of the courtroom months later, watching the guards lead me away with a quiet, satisfied smile on her face. "Brooklyn," I said. I forced my voice to tremble, letting my eyes wander around the room as if I were too anxious to look her in the eye. It's so crowded in here. I can barely breathe with all these people staring at me." Brooklyn stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the dark wood floor. She reached out and gently took my free hand. Her fingers were warm. Too warm. "I know, sweetie," she murmured, her voice filled with deep, tragic concern. "Grandfather's passing has taken such a heavy toll on you. You've been carrying so much weight on your shoulders. You look absolutely exhausted." "I am," I whispered, making sure my voice carried just enough for Andrew Norman to hear us. "I don't think I can do this, Brooklyn. The meeting with Philip tomorrow, the paperwork, the company, it's too much. I don't want the seat. I think I want to step down. I think you should be the one to lead the Phillips group." I held my breath, waiting. In my first life, Brooklyn had spent years quietly complaining that grandfather ignored her talents. If my plan was working, she would see this as her golden opportunity to finally take the crown she always wanted. She would act comforting, tell me she would handle everything, and help me draft the resignation letter. But she didn't smile. Instead, her eyes widened with a look of pure, horrified selflessness. "Oh, Isabella, no," Brooklyn said. Her voice rose just enough to cut through the quiet murmurs of the nearby guests. Several board members stopped talking and turned their attention to us. "You mustn't say things like that. We all know how incredibly hard you've worked for this. Grandfather spent years teaching you everything he knew." My heart did a strange, uncomfortable flutter. "Brooklyn, please, I'm serious. I'm not fit for—" "No, I won't hear of it," she interrupted smoothly. Her grip on my hand suddenly tightened. It wasn't a comforting squeeze. It was tight, rigid, and unyielding. The strength in her fingers didn't match the soft, tearful expression on her face. She looked directly into my eyes, her gaze locked onto mine with a chilling focus. "I am just the younger sister," Brooklyn said, her voice dripping with sweet humility as she addressed the watching board members. "I don't have your education or your brilliance, Isabella. I would only ruin grandfather's hard work. I will happily stand in your shadow and support you as our next leader. I will make sure you get exactly what you deserve." Andrew Norman nodded approvingly from the corner of the room, whispering something to the man beside him about Brooklyn's beautiful family loyalty. I stared at her, the blood draining from my face. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the coldness in her grip. Brooklyn loved power. She loved attention. In my first life, she had hated me for being the chosen one. So why was she fighting so hard to keep me in the spotlight? Why was she refusing the crown when I was handing it to her on a silver platter? "You need to be strong, sister," Brooklyn whispered, leaning in closer. Her face was inches from mine, her perfect smile unchanged, but her eyes were entirely dead. "You know we have a big day tomorrow. You wouldn't want to disappoint grandfather." She knew. The realization hit me like a splash of ice water. She didn't want the inheritance because she knew exactly what was hidden in those offshore accounts. She knew about the debt, the syndicate, and the prison cell waiting for whoever took the title. Brooklyn hadn't just watched me ruin my life in the first timeline. She'd traveled back in time too, and she was going to make sure I took the fall all over again. The headquarters of the Phillips Group was a towering pillar of glass and steel that overlooked the city skyline. From the outside, it looked like a monument to success. From the inside, to anyone who knew the truth, it was a beautifully decorated trap. I sat in the main conference room, staring at the long glass table. My grandfather's empty chair sat at the head of the table. Sitting to my right was Philip Buchanan. He was adjusting a stack of legal folders, his expression solemn and heavy. He had been our family lawyer for decades, a man who knew how to bury secrets deep enough that even the dirt wouldn't whisper them. "We have some time before the rest of the board members arrive, Isabella," Philip said, his voice low and comforting. "Are you sure you are up for this? We can postpone the formal transition if the grief is too much." "No, Philip," I said, putting on a brave but slightly weary smile. "I want to get this over with. But before we discuss me taking grandfather's seat, there is something we need to do for the sake of the company." Philip tilted his head, his gray eyebrows rising slightly. "Oh, and what is that?" "I want a full, public financial audit of the Phillips Group, immediately." I watched his face closely. In my first life, I had never questioned the books. I had simply signed whatever Philip and the board put in front of me. This time, I knew exactly what was hiding in the offshore accounts. If a reputable third-party firm came in and dug through the transactions, they would find the mismatched numbers and the massive unexplained debts. Once those red flags were public, the federal regulatory agencies would freeze our assets. The board would be forced to halt the CEO transition, and the company would go into forced liquidation. I would be free. I wouldn't inherit a single cent of the toxic empire, and more importantly, I wouldn't inherit the prison sentence. "An audit?" Philip asked, his voice losing some of its warmth. He set his pen down. "Isabella, our books are reviewed annually. A public audit right now, so soon after your grandfather's passing, could make the investors nervous. It might suggest we suspect some kind of instability." "It's about transparency, Philip," I insisted, leaning forward. "If I'm going to lead, I want to start with a completely clean slate. I've actually already contacted an independent firm. Lucia Quintana is waiting in the lobby." I had specifically chosen Lucia Quintana. In the previous timeline, she was known as a fiercely independent auditor who couldn't be bought. She had a reputation for finding even the most deeply buried financial discrepancies. Before Philip could argue, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open. Brooklyn walked in. She was wearing a tailored navy blue suit today. Her hair parted neatly in the middle. She carried a tablet in one hand and a soft, supportive smile on her face. She looked like she had slept peacefully, unlike me, who had spent the entire night pacing my bedroom floor. "Good morning, Philip, Isabella," Brooklyn said, sweetly, taking a seat directly across from me. She looked at the folders on the table. "Am I interrupting a private discussion?" "Your sister is requesting an immediate public audit of our entire financial history," Philip explained, looking at Brooklyn as if she would help him talk some sense into me. I braced myself. I expected Brooklyn to panic. She knew about the illegal syndicate money just as well as I did. If Lucia Quintana exposed the company's rot, Brooklyn's plans to slide the toxic CEO chair over to me would be ruined. She would have to fight me on this. Instead, Brooklyn's smile only widened. "Oh, Isabella, that is a marvelous idea. You are so incredibly responsible. I agree completely. We should bring Miss Quintana in right away." My chest tightened. I stared at my sister, trying to read the blank space behind her eyes. Why was she agreeing? Did she not realize that a real audit would destroy the company before she could trap me with it? 10 minutes later, Lucia Quintana was seated at the end of the table, her laptop open, scrolling through our primary digital ledgers. I sat silently, waiting for her to stop, frown, and point out the massive black hole in our offshore holdings. I waited for her to ask why $20 million in logistics funding had vanished into a shell company 3 months ago. The room was completely silent, except for the soft tapping of Lucia's fingers on her keyboard. After what felt like an eternity, Lucia closed her laptop. She looked up, her expression completely neutral. "Well?" I asked, my voice slightly tight. "Did you find any discrepancies in the offshore accounts, Miss Quintana? Any unusual debt transfers?" Lucia gave a short, professional nod. "The books are entirely immaculate, Miss Phillips. Every transaction is accounted for. The offshore tax structures are fully compliant, and your grandfather's transition files are perfectly in order. There is absolutely nothing out of place." I froze. "What? That's impossible! Did you check the logistics subsidiary? The secondary transport ledgers?" "I checked everything," Lucia said, her voice completely flat. She wouldn't look me in the eye. Her gaze was fixed slightly to the left, staring at the wall. "Your company is in perfect financial health." My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at Lucia, and then I saw it. A slight, barely noticeable tremor in her hand as she packed her laptop into her bag. She got to her first, I realized, a wave of cold dread washing over me. Brooklyn traveled back with her memories, too. She knew exactly who Lucia Quintana was, and she must have known some dark, deeply buried secret about her own past or family, something powerful enough to make an untouchable auditor lie to cover up a multi-million-dollar financial crime. "See, Isabella?" Brooklyn said softly, her voice echoing in the quiet room. She turned to Philip and the other board members who had just started filtering into the room. "I told you my sister is a visionary. She wanted to prove to all of you that the Phillips Group is stronger than ever. Thanks to her leadership and her demand for this audit, we can all rest easy." Philip smiled warmly, clearly relieved. "Indeed. Excellent work, Isabella. Your dedication to transparency has solidified the board's confidence. There is no doubt now that you are ready to take your grandfather's place." The board members began to clap softly, offering me warm nods of approval. I sat there, paralyzed, as the trap closed a little tighter around me. My attempt to blow up the company had only succeeded in making me look like a brilliant, diligent leader in the eyes of the board. My phone buzzed in my lap. I quietly slid it out of my pocket under the edge of the glass table. It was an incoming message from an unknown encrypted number. I opened it. "Nice try with the audit, sister, but the crown is yours." I looked up. Across the table, Brooklyn was politely pouring herself a glass of water, her face a mask of perfect, innocent, sisterly love. The dining room of the Phillips family estate was built to intimidate. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the high ceiling, casting a sharp, glittering light over the long dining table. Tonight the air was thick with the rich scent of roasted lamb and rosemary, but the atmosphere felt more like a courtroom than a family dinner. Sitting around the table were the major shareholders of the Phillips Group. To my left sat Andrew Norman, his expansive suit stretched tight over his broad frame. He was a man driven entirely by greed, always looking for a way to increase his profit margins. In my first life, Andrew had been one of the first to sell his shares and run when the federal investigation began, leaving me holding the bag. To my right sat Brooklyn. She was quietly cutting her food, her movements graceful and calm. She looked like the perfect, supportive younger sister, completely content to let me sit at the head of the table in our grandfather's empty place. "The audit was a brilliant move, Isabella," Andrew said, raising his wine glass toward me. "It showed the market that the transition of power will be seamless. The stock price has already stabilized." "Thank you, Andrew," I said, keeping my voice steady. But a clean audit doesn't mean we are out of the woods. The real estate market is shifting, and I believe we need to be cautious. This was my second move. Since I couldn't expose the company's crimes through a public audit, I had to find another way to get rid of my shares. If I could convince a major shareholder like Andrew Norman to buy me out, I could walk away with a massive pile of clean cash. To make that happen, I had to give him a reason to want my shares and a reason to think I was too weak to keep them. Actually, Andrew, I continued, leaning forward and lowering my voice as if sharing a confidential worry, I've been looking over our secondary development projects. I found a rather worrying discrepancy in the land acquisition reports for the North Side Logistics Hub. It seems we overpaid by nearly $4 million. Andrew paused, his fork hovering near his plate. Overpaid by $4 million? That wasn't in the audit report. It was buried deep in the local municipal filing fees, I said, letting a touch of panic creep into my expression. I'm worried our internal controls are failing. If the press gets a hold of this, it could look like we are hiding losses. To be honest, I don't know if I have the strength to manage this kind of instability right now. I've been seriously considering selling a portion of my majority shares to someone who can handle the pressure. I watched his eyes. Right on cue, a spark of calculation flickered behind his heavy eyelids. A hostile takeover was exactly what a man like him dreamed of. If he bought my shares at a discount because I was panicking, he could seize control of the board. I would get my clean payout, and he would inherit the massive, ticking financial bomb of the Phillips Group. "Is that so?" Andrew murmured, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Well, Isabella, if the burden is truly too heavy, we shouldn't force you to carry it. Perhaps we could discuss a private transfer of your shares. I could take them off your hands, for the good of the family name, of course." I felt a sudden rush of hope. It was working. I was going to hand him the poisoned crown, and he was eagerly reaching for it. "That sounds like a very mature solution." Brooklyn's voice cut through the quiet hum of the room. We both looked at her. Brooklyn set her knife and fork down with a soft, metallic click. She offered Andrew a warm, dazzling smile. "It's so comforting to know we have friends like you, Andrew, but I'm sure you have your own worries to think about. After all, running a business is hard work, especially when you have to keep so many secrets." Andrew's smile faltered. "Secrets? I'm not sure what you mean, Brooklyn." "Oh, just the usual corporate stress, like managing those private, undeclared offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, the ones under the name Norman Holdings. I imagine keeping those hidden from the Revenue Service must take up a lot of your energy." The color instantly drained from Andrew's face. He froze, his hand trembling slightly against the stem of his wine glass. I stared at my sister, my stomach dropping. How did she know about those accounts? In our first life, Andrew's tax evasion scheme wasn't exposed until 3 years after the Phillips Group collapsed. Brooklyn shouldn't have had access to that information yet, but she did, because she had lived through it too. I don't know what you're talking about," Andrew stammered, his voice losing all of its corporate confidence. "Of course you don't," Brooklyn said, her voice dripping with sweet, sisterly innocence. "It's probably just a silly rumor I heard, but it would be such a shame if someone accidentally forwarded those filing numbers to the authorities. It's always best to keep things simple, don't you think?" Andrew looked from Brooklyn to me, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He knew he was trapped. If he tried to buy my shares or challenge my position, Brooklyn would ruin him with a single phone call. "Actually," Andrew said, his voice hoarse as he cleared his throat and pushed his chair back slightly, I think I've changed my mind. In fact, I believe Isabella is doing a wonderful job. I would be more than happy to sign my proxy voting rights over to her to show my complete support for her leadership." I would... "Andrew, wait." I tried to intervene, but it was too late. "No, no, I insist," Andrew said quickly, raising his hands in surrender. "You have my full backing, Isabella. I'll have my assistant send over the authorization forms first thing tomorrow morning." He practically bolted from the table, leaving his half-eaten dinner behind. The dining room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. I sat there, staring at my plate, the realization of my defeat sinking in. By threatening Andrew, Brooklyn had forced him to give me more power. I was now even closer to being named the official, undivided leader of the Phillips Group. I slowly turned to look at my sister. Brooklyn was smiling warmly at me. She picked up the serving dish of roasted vegetables and held it out to me with a gentle, caring gesture. "You look so pale, Isabella," Brooklyn said, her voice incredibly soft, yet carrying a freezing edge that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "You really must eat. You're going to need all your strength to carry our family's future on your shoulders." The glow from the dual monitors washed over my face in the dark study. Outside, a midnight storm was beginning to roll over the hills, rattling the window panes with distant thunder. I sat with my laptop open, connected to a highly secure encrypted terminal routed through a private bank in Zurich. This was my last line of defense. If I couldn't ruin the company and I couldn't sell my shares, then I would strip the giant of its armor. The Phillips Group held roughly $20 million in clean, uncompromised cash reserves, funds entirely separate from the dirty syndicate accounts. If I could quietly siphon this money into private, untraceable digital wallets, I could pack a single suitcase, leave the country under a different name, and let the empty, toxic shell of the company collapse on whoever was left. Namely, Brooklyn. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I had spent the last 3 nights setting up the transfer routes. I was using my personal executive credentials to authorize the shift, but I was routing the path through 3 different international banks to mask the destination. Just 10 more minutes, I thought, watching the progress bar on the screen. Just 10 minutes, and I am free. "It's a very clever route," a voice said from the doorway. My heart nearly stopped. I slammed my laptop half closed and spun around in my chair. Brooklyn was leaning against the doorframe. She was wearing a soft silk robe, holding a warm mug of tea in her hands. She looked completely relaxed, as if she had just wandered down for a midnight snack. But her eyes were sharp, reflecting the blue light of my computer screens. "Brooklyn," I said, my voice tight as I struggled to keep my breathing even. "What are you doing up?" "I couldn't sleep," she said softly, walking into the room. Her bare feet made no sound against the thick rug. The mask of the doting, humble younger sister was completely gone. Her face was cold, her expression filled with a tired, heavy exhaustion. "Do you really think I don't know what a capital flight looks like? You're draining the clean reserves. You're preparing to run." I stared at her, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. The silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating, until the truth finally forced its way into the open. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You know what grandfather did. You know what's in those accounts. You watched me go to prison in our first life. Why are you trying so hard to force me back into that cell?" Brooklyn looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see smug satisfaction in her eyes. I saw a deep, dark terror. "Because if you don't go into that cell, Isabella, I will," she said, her voice trembling. She took a slow, shuddering breath and stared past me, her eyes focused on some empty point in the dark room. "You think you were the only one who suffered," she whispered. "You think I lived a beautiful, happy life after you were arrested. But you were the shield, Isabella. You took the fall, and for a few months I thought I was safe. I thought I had won." She let out a dry, humorless laugh that sounded completely hollow. "But the syndicate didn't care that you were in prison. They still wanted their laundry machine. They realized grandfather had left a second granddaughter, and they realized I had access to the remaining accounts. Within a year, they cornered me. They forced me to sign worse agreements, using my name on documents that would have put me away for life. I was trapped, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the door to be kicked down." Brooklyn stepped closer, her face turning pale in the blue light of the monitors. "And then came the night it all ended. I was in my living room. The rain was pouring, just like tonight. Suddenly, the power went out. My home security system went completely silent. I heard the lock click on the front door. I ran to the stairs, but they were already in the hall. 2 men in dark coats. No words, no demands. Just a cold hand over my mouth and a sharp, freezing pain in my side as they pushed me down. She gripped her own side instinctively, her fingers digging into the silk of her robe as if she could still feel the wound. I lay on the floor in the dark, watching my own blood pool on the rug, begging whatever was listening for a second chance. My vision went completely black. The last thing I felt was the freezing cold of my own body. She paused, a sharp tremor running through her shoulders. And then I gasped. I opened my eyes, sitting bolt upright in my bed. The sun was shining through my window. The calendar on my nightstand read 2 weeks before grandfather's passing. I was back. I was alive. But the moment the shock wore off, I realized the terrible truth. If I didn't want to die on that floor again, I had to make absolutely sure you took the crown this time. I had to make sure you stayed in that spotlight so the syndicate and the federal government stayed focused entirely on you. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Brooklyn wasn't fighting me out of greed or petty jealousy. She was running from the exact same ghosts I was. We were both just trying not to drown. "We are playing a zero-sum game, Isabella," Brooklyn whispered, her voice hardening again as she recovered her composure. "Only one of us can survive this. If you run, the feds will come for the next in line. That's me. If I let you slide the CEO seat to me, I inherit the target on my back. I won't let that happen. I am going to make sure you stay right where grandfather put you." "I won't let you trap me again, Brooklyn," I said, my voice growing cold. "The transfer is already authorized. By tomorrow morning, the clean funds will be gone and I'll be out of your reach." Brooklyn looked at the laptop, and a slow, chilling smile returned to her face. "Are they?" she asked, softly. A cold dread pooled in my stomach. I turned and threw the laptop screen back open. My eyes scanned the transaction logs. The progress bar was gone. The transfer had completed, but the destination field had changed. The funds hadn't gone to my private wallets. They had been rerouted into a secondary holding account, one registered directly under my personal IP address using my private security keys, but with a paper trail that made it look like I was actively hiding corporate assets from the board. "I noticed the dip in the reserves yesterday," Brooklyn said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "So I took the liberty to update your routing codes. If the authorities look at those accounts now, they won't see a sister trying to escape. They will see a greedy CEO embezzling $20 million from her grandfather's dying company. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. Every move I made to free myself was being systematically turned into the very evidence that would convict me. "You have a big day tomorrow, sister," Brooklyn whispered, leaning down to pick up her tea. She walked back toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "Philip is reading the will at 10. Make sure you wear something nice." The morning of the reading of the will was bright and completely clear, a sharp contrast to the dark storm of the night before. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Philip Buchanan's private office. The room was silent, smelling of fresh paper and expensive leather. Philip sat behind a large glass desk, looking through a stack of thick, bound folders. To my left sat Brooklyn. She had returned to her role as the perfect, supportive sister, wearing a soft, cream-colored blouse and a quiet, respectful expression. She had even brought me a cup of chamomile tea, which sat untouched on the table beside me. I sat rigid, my hands resting in my lap. I hadn't slept. My mind had spent the last 8 hours running through every possible escape route, analyzing the legal boundaries of our grandfather's estate. I had found only one loophole. It was a massive gamble, but it was the only card I had left to play. "Thank you both for coming," Philip cleared his throat as he looked up from the documents. "I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but Spencer was very clear about his wishes. He wanted his transition plan executed immediately upon his passing." Philip opened the primary folder, sliding a pair of reading glasses onto his nose. "According to your grandfather's final testament, 80% of the voting shares and the official title of Chief Executive Officer of the Phillips Group are to be inherited solely by you, Isabella." I felt the weight of those words, heavy and cold, settle over the room. "However," Philip continued, turning a page, "Spencer was also a highly practical man. He understood that a business of this scale requires absolute dedication. Therefore, he added a specific binding clause." I leaned forward slightly. I already knew what was coming, but I had to play the part. "If the primary heir, in this case Isabella, officially declines the position or steps down before the formal transition is completed, the entire inheritance, including all majority shares, assets, and associated administrative liabilities, automatically defaults to the secondary heir, which, of course, is you, Brooklyn." Brooklyn's expression remained perfectly calm, but I saw her fingers twitch slightly against her lap. "The decision must be made today," Philip said, looking directly at me. "Isabella, do you accept your grandfather's final appointment?" This was the moment. Brooklyn looked at me, a tiny, almost invisible smirk playing at the corner of her lips. She thought she had me completely cornered. She had blocked my audit, secured my major shareholder, and rigged my offshore transfer to look like embezzlement. If I accepted, I took the fall. If I declined, she would use the embezzlement trail she had created to ruin me anyway, while she stayed clean. I took a deep breath. I stood up from my chair. "Philip," I said, letting my voice shake slightly with a highly practiced look of grief and exhaustion. "I've thought about this constantly since grandfather passed. I want to be strong. I want to honor his legacy. But after looking at the immense responsibility, I simply cannot do it. The stress is too much for me. I officially decline the position." Brooklyn's eyes flared with a sudden sharp panic. She shifted in her seat, her gaze locking onto mine. "Isabella, wait," Brooklyn said quickly, her voice losing its sweet tone. "You can't just give up. The company needs you. I I am not ready to handle something this massive. Philip, surely we can give her more time to think? The clause is very clear, Brooklyn, Philip said, shaking his head regretfully. If Isabella declines, the transfer is automatic. The paperwork is already prepared. By declining, Isabella legally passes the entire entity of the Phillips Group and every single one of its corporate liabilities directly to you. I'm so sorry, Brooklyn, I said, turning to her with a tearful apology. But I know you will do a wonderful job. Brooklyn slowly rose from her chair, her face pale. She looked at me, her eyes screaming with a silent, desperate rage. She knew that by accepting, she was stepping directly on the landmine. But she also knew she couldn't decline either, or the assets would be frozen, exposing her own past life actions. She had to end this now. Philip, Brooklyn said, her voice freezing. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive, tossing it onto the glass desk. Before we finalize any transfer, you need to see this. Isabella has been quietly siphoning $20 million from our clean reserves over the last 72 hours. I have the digital signatures and the IP routing logs right here. She is trying to run with our family's money. Philip's eyebrows shot up. He looked at the drive and then at me, his expression hardening. Isabella? Is this true? I didn't panic. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I took a step toward the desk and looked directly at Brooklyn. It is true that $20 million was moved, Philip, but it wasn't embezzled, Philip, and it didn't go to a private wallet. I used those funds to settle a very specific, highly urgent debt. Brooklyn's frown first, her confident posture shifting. What are you talking about? 2 days ago, I realized our logistics subsidiary was heavily compromised by an external syndicate. I knew that if the main company took the fall for their debts, we would all go down. So I used my temporary executive authority to legally spin off that toxic subsidiary into a completely separate, independent corporate entity. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the pocket of my oversized dress and slid it across the glass desk toward Philip. I transferred the $20 million to buy out the syndicate's interest in that subsidiary, completely decoupling it from the main Phillips Group. The main company is now entirely clean. The toxic liabilities are completely contained within that new, separate business. Philip quickly scanned the document. His eyes widened. This is a masterstroke, Isabella. You've completely insulated the Phillips Group from a massive legal risk. Brooklyn's breath hitched. She took a step forward, grabbing the edge of the desk. And who is the sole owner of this new subsidiary? I smiled warmly, looking my sister dead in the eyes. To make sure the transition of the main company was completely clean, I had to assign a sole proprietor to the spinoff. And since you were so eager to help me with the paperwork, Brooklyn, I used the authorization codes and the power of attorney signatures you left on my computer last night to register the subsidiary entirely under your name. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. You wanted to frame me for embezzlement using my credentials, but you forgot that in our first life you gave me your private authorization codes to manage your accounts. I still remembered them. Brooklyn stared at the document, the truth crashing down on her. The $20 million hadn't been stolen. It had been used to buy her the sole ownership of the toxic, syndicate-controlled debt machine. Before she could speak, the glass doors of Philip's office suite rattled. Through the frosted glass of the lobby, we could see several figures in dark suits walking quickly toward the entrance, led by a man holding a federal warrant. Brooklyn's phone buzzed violently in her hand. It was a high-priority financial alert from the Federal Crimes Unit, flagging her personal registration of the newly formed subsidiary. The trap had finally closed, but the teeth were buried deep in Brooklyn's leg. The heavy glass doors of the office suite shattered the silence of the room as they were pushed open. 4 federal agents in dark suits stepped into the lobby, their expressions grim and unyielding. The lead agent held a white folder containing the official warrant, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto us. "Philip Buchanan?" the lead agent called out, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We have a federal warrant for the immediate seizure of all assets associated with the newly registered logistics subsidiary and an arrest warrant for its sole proprietor." Philip stood up slowly, his face completely pale as he looked from the agents to Brooklyn. Yes, of course. I am the family counsel." Brooklyn didn't move. She stood frozen by the edge of the glass desk, her hand trembling so violently that her phone slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the floor. The screen lit up one last time, displaying the red-lettered notification from the Financial Crimes Unit, before going dark. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mix of shock, betrayal, and absolute terror. The confident, untouchable sister who had spent 2 lifetimes trying to outsmart me had finally run out of moves. "You," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You planned this. You knew I would try to use your credentials." "I knew you couldn't resist trying to finish what you started," I said softly, my voice calm and entirely steady. "You were so focused on making sure I took the fall for grandfather's choices that you didn't look at the files I left open on the screen. You thought you were redirecting my escape route. In reality, you were signing your own name to the ledger." The agents walked into the private office, their footsteps heavy against the floor. "Brooklyn Phillips?" the lead agent asked, stepping toward her. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, active money laundering, and the illegal concealment of syndicate debt through the newly registered subsidiary. You have the right to remain silent." Brooklyn didn't scream. She didn't fight. She let the officer step behind her, her shoulders slumping as the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The mask of the elegant, perfect heiress had completely disintegrated, leaving behind only the terrified girl who had died in the dark in her previous life. As they began to lead her out of the office, she stopped. She turned her head back to look at me, her voice trembling. "We could have worked together, Isabella," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We both knew the truth. We could have destroyed them together." "No, we couldn't," I said, looking her dead in the eyes. "Because even in this life, you still wanted to watch me go to prison first. You were never trying to save us, Brooklyn. You were only trying to save yourself." She didn't answer. She lowered her head and let the officers guide her out of the suite, her heels clicking a slow, heavy rhythm down the hallway until she vanished through the lobby doors. I stood in the quiet office for a long moment, listening to the distant, fading sound of the police sirens outside. "Isabella," Philip said, his voice hesitant as he adjusted his glasses. "The main company, the Phillips Group. With the subsidiary completely severed and the liabilities transferred, the 80% majority shares are entirely clean. The entire $130 million empire." I turned to look at the empty chair at the head of the desk. The crown was finally clean. The poison was gone. "Sell it," I said quietly. Philip blinked in surprise. "Sell it? But Isabella, you've just saved the company. You could run it without any of the risks now." "No," I said, reaching down to pick up my small handbag. "I've spent 2 lifetimes running from this family shadow," I said, a genuine, free smile finally touching my lips. "It's time I finally go see the sun." I walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at the sunlit office one last time. "I've spent 2 lifetimes running from this family shadow," I said. It's time I finally go see the sun.